What's going on, everybody? My name is E. Mackey, and today's topic of discussion is the Civil War. Now, we're going to talk about the Civil War today as a part of a series of videos that I'm going to create that kind of outline the history of the Black experience in America. And the reason why I'm doing this is because this content goes along with a book that I just finished writing called Lift Every Voice to kind of outline some of the content that's inside of the book. I'll tell you about the book more later, but for right now, let's get into the history of the Civil War. Okay, now depending on how and where you were raised in the United States, your perception of the Civil War could be vastly different. Some people think that the Civil War was fought for states' rights. Other people think that the Civil War was fought over slavery. And both people would kind of be right in the sense that the Civil War was fought over states' rights to keep slaves. I mean, basically, that's what it was about. But even deeper than that was that it wasn't necessarily just about slavery as much as it was about the financial components of slavery and who got to control it. Now, what a lot of people may not know is that one of the major contributing factors of the start of the Civil War could kind of be traced back to the execution of a white abolitionist named John Brown. Now, John Brown, like I said, was a white abolitionist that grew up in a very progressive family. He was always taught that black people were equal to everybody else and that slavery was wrong. So one day when he was about 12 years old, running errands for his family, he witnessed a little black boy around his age being beat with a shovel, and it was a situation that put him on the path of fighting for the rights of black people. And because of this, he actually had a really good relationship with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. So in his later years of life, John Brown got the idea that he wanted to lead a slave revolt. And so he starts to go and plan this out. He reached out to Frederick Douglass and he asked Frederick Douglass if he'd be down to help him plan out this slave revolt. And Frederick Douglass was like, nah, bruh, don't want to touch it. Don't want to have anything to do with it. So then he reached out to Harriet Tubman, and Harriet Tubman, like the bad boss black woman she is, was totally down. She didn't get involved directly, but what she did do was connect him with a lot of the resources and people that she knew, including like stops from the Underground Railroad. And it kind of got him on the path and the track that where he needed to go to be able to plan this thing out. So on the night of October 16th, 1859, John Brown and about 22 other men raided Harpers Ferry Arsenal. Now, Harpers Ferry Arsenal was a military arsenal that was owned by the United States government, and his plan was to go in, steal a bunch of the weapons, and give them to the slaves so that they could have weaponry for a slave revolt. So on the night of October 16th, 1859, John Brown was able to actually get into the arsenal and successfully take it over. The problem was that he got caught and eventually got trapped inside. By the next day, a company of U.S. Marines arrived that are led by Robert E. Lee. Yes, that Robert E. Lee. At this time, there was no Confederacy, so Robert E. Lee was actually a part of the U.S. Marine Corps. At any rate, they get there, they surround the building, and a fight ensues over the next 2 days. In the fight, John Brown is injured. 2 of his sons are killed and 8 of his men are killed as well. Now, on November 2nd, John Brown is taken to trial. He's found guilty of treason and murder and sentenced to death. So December 2nd, 1859, John Brown was executed. And before the execution, there had been a lot of press and media that had come out to cover the execution because by this time, this was major news. So he gets executed. News of his execution spread throughout the country like wildfire. It was almost kind of like a George Floyd situation in the fact that the word of his execution kind of helped polarize the country. The country was already polarized, but this kind of ignited it more. And a fierce debate over what to do about slavery ensued. Now, 1859 was a year before the presidential race that Abraham Lincoln ran in. So in December of 1859, you can think pretty much that the presidential candidates are campaigning. So this really catapulted slavery and that discussion and that tension into the stratosphere and really made it a very, very, very important topic surrounding the election. So contrary to popular belief about slavery, the debate over slavery back then wasn't necessarily a moral debate. It wasn't about, oh, these are black people, these are humans. we need to end slavery, the debate was really more about economics. It was really more so about, if the South has slaves, the South will make more money and the South will have more influence. So we don't want the South to have that much influence. Obviously, the South is more interested in keeping the slaves because it's free labor and it's helping to boost this economy. Any business person knows that payroll is probably one of the biggest expenses that you have. So obviously, it's in the best interest of the South to keep slavery, while it's in the North's best interest for the South to have limited to no slavery, because they don't want the South to get too much control or too much power, particularly financially. Another thing was, at this time, there was a westward expansion. So the United States was kind of expanding west. Now, the South was interested in slavery expanding along with that expansion. So basically, as we took over territories to the west, the South was more interested in keeping the institution of slavery in that expansion, and the North was like, oh, no, we don't want slavery anywhere more than where it already is, because like I said before, the North could see how that could give the South a much bigger advantage financially and much more power overall. So now it's 1860 and the presidential race has heated up. There are 4 major presidential candidates, and they are obviously Abraham Lincoln, John C. Breckinridge, John Bell, and Stephen A. Douglas. Okay, so I'm sure I don't need to tell you that Abraham Lincoln won this election, but what is important to know is how he won the election. Here's a map denoting the states that Lincoln carried, and those states are in the North primarily and in pink. He didn't win any of the southern states, as you can see, so it's not hard to imagine that the South was not happy with the results of the election, and the backlash was instant. So to give you some context, Abraham Lincoln was elected on November 6, 1860. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union. When South Carolina does this, it creates a domino effect of states starting to secede, like rapidly. And on January 9th, 1861, Mississippi would become the second state to secede from the Union. Mississippi plainly states, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interests of the world. And they would go on to state that its labor supplies a product which constitutes by far the largest and most important proportions of the commerce of the earth. A blow to slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. So there's no question whatsoever that Mississippi is seceding because they want to continue to have slaves. Don't let anybody tell you anything differently. On January 10th, Florida seceded, followed by Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama, leading to the formation of the Confederacy on the same day. Then on April 12th, 1861, the Civil War would start with the Battle of Fort Sumter. Now, after the start of the Civil War, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina would also secede. By this time in 1862, Lincoln was in a really complicated political situation. So you can imagine, I just became the president, and as soon as I became the president, states just start falling off. They don't want to have anything to do with me. And I could imagine that he probably felt like, yo, the country's falling apart under my leadership. So Lincoln is right now really concerned with trying to pull the country back together and save it so that he's not the reason that the country fell apart. So it's not really hard to imagine that Lincoln was probably facing a lot of criticism from a lot of different angles. And on August 20th of 1862, a man named Horace Greeley, who was the publisher of a very prominent newspaper, wrote a letter to Lincoln called The Prayer of 20 Millions that he published in his newspaper. So his newspaper was super prominent, and when he put this out, everybody knew about it. He basically called out Lincoln and was saying, hey, Lincoln, we got you in office. You were supposed to do something about slavery. What's good? What's up? When are you going to address the issue of slavery? Now, Lincoln got wind of this letter that was written to him, and he was a little frustrated, and he responded with a letter to Horace Greeley that was published in a newspaper not long after. So in this letter, Lincoln said that if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that also. This is really important because this thing that Lincoln wrote could really make a lot of people hate him, because it looks like he didn't really give a F about the slaves, which, man, who knows, maybe he didn't. But what's really happening here is something that's really important to understand as a strategic political move. What Lincoln is doing right now is basically signaling to the South that, hey, I'm down to negotiate. If it means that I got to keep slavery intact to get this union back together, I'll keep slavery intact. But what he's also doing is signaling to the South that, yo, if it means I need to crush slavery, I'll crush slavery. What people didn't know when he wrote this letter is that Lincoln had already written the Emancipation Proclamation, but he had just not released it to the public yet. So he has this letter, Emancipation Proclamation, written with the intention of abolishing slavery, at least in the southern states that had seceded, but nobody knew about it because he was waiting on the right time politically to drop it. So in the following month, September 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln announces the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, a lot of people think that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, and that's not exactly what happened. So basically, the Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln issuing an ultimatum to the southern states that had seceded from the Union. It was basically saying, look, I'm giving you guys a certain amount of time to rejoin the Union. And if you don't rejoin the Union, I am going to declare all the slaves that you own as free on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation really didn't say anything about the slaves in the states that were still part of the Union. It was only an ultimatum for the slaves that were in the states that had seceded. None of the states took Lincoln up on that offer to rejoin the Union. So on January 1st, 1863, all slaves were declared free. And what this basically meant was that if a slave escaped one of the Confederate states and found his way to the Union, that slave would then be free forever and would not ever have to go back and be subjected to slavery ever again. Now fast forward 2 years and we are in January 1865. And January 1865 was actually the start of a very beautiful progressive movement for the rights of black people in the country. One of the first things that came out of it was Special Field Order number 15. Now you may be more familiar with Special Field Order number 15 as the idea of black people getting 40 acres and a mule, because that's what it was. Now Special Field Order 15 was designed to reallocate about 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land. Now the idea was to take this land and give it to freed black people to create an autonomous area for them where no white people could come at all. In fact, the only white people that were allowed to come were white people that were a part of the military, and that was only to protect the rights of the black people that were there. White people couldn't work there, white people couldn't visit there, white people couldn't live there. They were to leave black people alone and let them live in peace. Now this land was actually prime real estate. It stretched from Charleston, South Carolina, all the way down to St. John's River in Florida. And the beautiful thing about this land was it was beachfront property. It went from the shore to 30 miles inland, all the way down. Now today we understand it as some of the most valuable land you could give away because it was basically beachfront, like prime real estate. And it would have been really dope if we were able to keep it. And I'll get into how we lost that land in the next video. But for now, we're gonna fast forward to April 9th, 1865, where General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in Appomattox, and this signaled the end of the Civil War. Now 5 days later, on April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was famously watching a play when John Wilkes Booth walked in and shot him in the back of the head. He'd eventually die the next day. And that is the end of our story for today. Now, earlier in the video, I mentioned my book. Now, that book is called Lift Every Voice, and it's basically a timeline of the black experience in America. The book starts on August 20th of 1619, and the timeline extends all the way to August 28th of 2020. And it basically maps out some of the experiences that we've had as black people that led to the movement for Black lives that we had just this summer of 2020. In the book, I go over a lot of the history that we weren't taught in schools, but basically everything is outlined to give you a full story of the black experience and how we got to be where we are today. This information that was talked about in this video is all in the book. Like I said earlier, I'll have more episodes coming up to take you through the whole history of the book, But I hope you enjoyed this one going over the Civil War. The next episode, we'll talk about Reconstruction and how Reconstruction kind of shaped the Black experience as we know it today. If you're interested in finding out more about my book or pre-ordering the book, you can do so at the link in my bio or follow that link right there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really appreciate y'all. Take care.